Oh, you start from here, hopefully.
Okay. All right, let's go for the next one here.
Sorry about this.
There we go. Okay, this is the James Street cable car. And this was the shortest line, and it had the smallest cable cars. It ran from First and James, up James Street, to Broadway, where the car barn was located and where they made connections with other lines. And this picture here was taken in the mid-1930s, showing the car about to cross 2nd Avenue. So this is 2nd and James Street. That kind of nice little Art Deco building there, just to the left of the cable car, is still there. So this was, again, one of the various small companies that operated streetcars and cable cars in Seattle that all got combined into this big Seattle electric system. And boy, I sure wish I could figure out here. Let's try this. There we go. There we go. Okay, this is farther up the hill on James Street. And one of the things that really struck me about this picture was these false front townhouses. I'd never seen anything quite like that, but on that really steep grade of James Street, they really kind of stood out there. And there was that whole neighborhood that existed was built basically around the access that this James Street cable car provided. And most of these buildings were wiped out during the construction of I-5 in the early 1960s. But it was certainly an interesting ride up to Broadway. Let's see if I can do this again here. Madison was one of the 3 last lines. And so here in this picture, we're looking up Madison, looking east from the waterfront. And there's about 5 Madison cable cars in this view, if you really take a close look. This line originally went from Western Avenue by the waterfront all the way out Madison to the other foot of Madison Street here in Madison Park, just a block or 2 north of us here. And then in 1910, the cable car portion of it was cut back to 14th Avenue. So from that point on, it ran just from Western Avenue to 14th Avenue. And the outer end of the line that went to Madison Park was converted into a more conventional electric streetcar line that came into downtown on Pike Street. So the Madison line had a long and interesting history. And at that 1910 change, they built a new car barn just off of what's now the Seattle University campus. The university actually converted the building into a laboratory space, and it's still there today, that 1910 cable car barn for the Madison line. This is looking up 2nd Avenue from James Street. So if you look really closely at this picture, you can actually see the James Street cable car tracks crossing the electric streetcar tracks on 2nd Avenue. And this picture was taken in 1907. And 2nd Avenue was one of the really big downtown streetcar streets, lots of volumes of streetcars, especially during the rush hours. The Alaska building is the tall building here on the right that was completed just a few years before. A lot of people think of that as Seattle's first skyscraper. Another view of 2nd Avenue. Now this is looking from the opposite direction. So this is looking south on 2nd from Pine Street. And some of those buildings in the picture here, which this picture dates from about 1915, are still there. The Smith Tower, which was practically brand new, you can kind of see it in the fog in the distance here. And the old post office at 3rd and Union over on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the columns of that neat old building. But again, you know, there's about almost 10 streetcars that you can count in this picture, which gives you an idea of how busy Second Avenue was as a streetcar thoroughfare. Now, you get north of Pine Street and Second Avenue takes on a totally different character. Low-rise buildings. The regrade had just been completed a few years before this picture was taken, and so it's fairly level. And there's only one streetcar line here on this section of Second Avenue that comes from Queen Anne Hill. That's what we're seeing, the streetcar in the distance here in this picture. And it's also kind of interesting to see that even at this early date, this is again about 1915, we're seeing a lot of the switch starting to occur to automobile travel. A lot of Model Ts parked on the street, a lot of auto-oriented businesses. You see that billboard over on the right-hand side. And I'm sure there's a story behind that Pathé Exchange building that you see, because later on, this particular little neighborhood became the place where theater owners would go to preview new movies to exhibit at their theaters. And a whole cluster of Hollywood studios set up offices there to make that possible. First Avenue. This is looking from this is at the northwest corner of First and Pike. Pike Place Market is just to the left here. And we can see a couple of streetcars lining up and boarding passengers. The first one is headed to Fauntleroy in West Seattle. And the one behind it has just come from Ballard. And in the back, you see the Liberty Theater, a really beautiful terracotta theater that was torn down in the 50s and replaced with a parking lot. Really a real loss for Seattle architecture when that happened. But you can start to see here the beginnings of the afternoon rush hour in this picture that was taken about 1939 at First and Pike. I'm actually starting to get the hang of this now. Same corner, but now we're looking from the southeast portion of First and Pike. And again, you see the Pike Place Market, the corner market, and there's at least 5 or 6 streetcars in this picture on that section of First Avenue just north of Pike. And again, it gives you an idea of really heavy streetcar traffic that existed at that time. And notice that there are no traffic lights at First and Pike, and there's a traffic control officer there with one of those little mechanical devices that he could swing around to help control the traffic and make it so that one direction was going at a time. I can only imagine what it must have been like doing that kind of a job all day. Farther south on Second Avenue, this picture kind of starts to show how these rolling antiques, these streetcars that were built in the early 1900s, were starting to look a little out of place in downtown Seattle. So this picture again was taken in 1939, and you see the streetcar that had just come from the Summit Avenue route on Capitol Hill, heading down Second Avenue at Cherry Street. And there's an interesting bus over on the left-hand side of the picture here. That's a North Coast Line's bus. That was a company that predecessor to Greyhound, basically, that ran up and down the Highway 99 corridor. And you'll see here that bus is signed up to go to Chehalis. Interestingly enough, all the early streetcars in Seattle were operated by 2 people. And back in those days, they were all men. There weren't any women operating employees. And the cost of having both a operator, a motorman, and a conductor that collected the fares started to get to the point where the streetcars were converted to one-man operation. And by doing that, they put the fare box up in front. You had to go by the operator when you put your fare in. And also they installed what was called a dead man operation. The operator had to continuously squeeze on the the power level in order for the car to move. And if he had a heart attack or fell over or whatever, that dead man feature stopped the car immediately. And all of that was necessary before they could really convert from two-man to one-man operation, which of course meant a huge decrease in operating costs. So by this time in 1939, the whole system, apart from the cable cars remained two-person operated right until the very end. But the rest of the system had converted to one-man operation. This picture here, I found it quite interesting here, was taken during World War I, 1918. And in the background, you can see the Smith Tower. We're looking north on First Avenue South, kind of in the southerly part of Pioneer Square. And those tracks in the foreground are all steam railroad tracks. They are part of the line that connected the Holgate yards with the waterfront. And they had been there for many, many decades. I think the very last part of that track was just recently removed. And to the left, out of the picture, was a big shipyard called the Skinner and Eddy Shipyard. And the photographer actually caught the shift change at the shipyard in this picture. And you see all these people kind of rushing over to get onto the streetcars after they've gotten off work. Big employer, one of the biggest employers in Seattle at that time. And
shoot of the Moran shipyard?
Yes, yes. Let's see here. There are no streetcars in this photo. We're looking west on Jackson Street from 2nd Avenue South. And just about all the buildings in this picture are still there, including the Cadillac Hotel over there on the right. Everybody thought that was gone for good when the 2001 earthquake struck and part of it crumbled down into the street, but it was restored. The interesting thing about this picture, besides the streetcar track and the trolley overhead, is that at the end of the street, you see an elevated structure. Well, it wasn't the Alaska Way Viaduct. That came much later. It was the West Seattle elevated streetcar line. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but this was really the closest that Seattle ever came, before Sound Transit at least, to having rail rapid transit. And it was an attempt to basically provide an exclusive right-of-way for streetcars between downtown and West Seattle. And it didn't work out, unfortunately, but I'll get into that a little more here. This is how the West Seattle streetcars got into downtown. We're looking south on what's now today Alaskan Way, and the elevated streetcar trestle, mostly made of wood, by the way, opened in 1919, just after the end of World War I. And in fact, it was conceived during the war as a way of getting commuters to all those shipyard and waterfront industries, which were really the heart of Seattle's employment in those days. So the elevated section started at the corner of First and Washington in Pioneer Square. It ramped up, made this sharp turn to head south, running along what today is actually the alignment of Highway 99. Highway 99 is using the right-of-way that this elevated streetcar line used at that time. What happened here over time was kind of sad, because even though this provided really fast, reliable service for people in West Seattle, the city really didn't have the money to maintain it. It was built really quickly. It was built almost entirely of wood, as I mentioned, and it was untreated wood. So they were all constantly out there putting in new bents, new sections, trying to keep it from falling down. Trying to get to the next picture here. This was the other end of the elevated structure. This is at Spokane Street and 23rd Avenue South. And today, of course, this is unrecognizable because the Fauntleroy Expressway, that elevated expressway that comes down from the West Seattle Bridge, is all overhead here. But at this point in time, there was actually a concrete section of the elevated that connected 23rd and Spokane with the twin bascule bridges that cross the Duwamish River. And so, as you can see in the background there, this is where they ramp down and join surface traffic. Let's see. Now, just a little bit beyond the last picture, on a foggy morning in February of 1937 was the worst accident in Seattle streetcar history. And a car was coming downhill on Avalon Way, which is the track in the picture here that leads off to the right. And I'm sure anybody that's been to West Seattle at some point or another is familiar with Avalon Way. Before the Fauntleroy Expressway was opened in 1965, it was the primary entryway into West Seattle and the Junction area. It had two streetcar lines on it. They diverged at the junction. The reason why the junction was called the Junction. And one line went straight north along California Avenue to the Admiral District. The other line went south along California to Fauntleroy and ended up in a little neighborhood called Endaline, which of course was named for the end of the streetcar line. In any event, a car leaving from the Admiral District went through the junction, was loaded with commuters. This was the morning rush hour, and it came down Avalon Way and lost its brakes. So what ended up happening is it tipped over, and you can see that the car body has been separated from its wheels. The wheel sets there, you can see more in the foreground, and it's lying on its side. It basically hit the pillars of the Admiral Way viaduct there. And there were 2 people that were killed in this accident, and there were about 22 people that went to the hospital. It was a pretty major.
Those 2 people killed were relatives of mine, my aunt and a cousin in California were killed in that accident.
Oh wow!
I think it was Rochester. Their name was one of them was named Rochester. Sorry.
No, that's really interesting. I'm sure there were a lot of lives that were really touched by this accident. They never really determined exactly what happened, why the brakes had failed on the streetcar as it came down the hill. It was going about 30 miles an hour through a curve that you probably shouldn't have been going any more than 15 thereabouts. So a little north of the accident scene, this is a kind of a more everyday view of Harbor Avenue. And one of the things that really caught my fancy here in this view is this is the #1 Alki streetcar, by the way, which ran out Harbor Avenue and Alki Avenue and ended near the lighthouse. It was a pretty light streetcar line. I mean, in terms of ridership, its biggest loads always came during the summer when there were lots of people heading out to the beaches at Alki. And of course, back in those days, there was a full swimming pool, and if you go a little farther back, there's Luna Park, amusement park, right at Duwamish Head. Well, now this was much later than that. This was close to the end, about 1940, and those ships that are in the background, this was kind of a moorage area for the Alaska Steamship. I was kind of curious about the background here of this picture and did a little research on it. And just north of here is where Salty's restaurant is today, and how the neighborhood has changed.
Is that Seacrest Marina or Baycrest Marina, that building in the background there? Back?
That's a good question.
It is.
That could be, yeah. probably greatly remodeled. Now, when the city of Seattle acquired the streetcar network in 1919, there was one independent company that wasn't part of the sale, and that was the Seattle and Rainier Valley Railway. And so this company kind of limped along all during the 20s and into most of the 30s. It ran between downtown Seattle and Renton along Rainier Avenue, and had much to do with the development of that part of the city, especially Columbia City. Those are what you definitely would call streetcar suburbs. They had some very interesting streetcars that were built by the Moran brothers, the shipyard people, in 1910. And it kind of a home design and a home built car. And this is an example of one of them. The end of the line here was at 4th and Stewart. And again, a lot of the buildings there, I think I'm trying to remember the name of the building that's just left there, but that's still in place. The Orpheum Theater in the distance there, that's gone, obviously. But the Rainier Valley line operated on 4th Avenue in both directions, back before the one-way street grid, went along Dearborn Street to Rainier, and then Rainier all the way to Renton. But the interesting thing is that it was really more of a city streetcar line, because the service ran every 10 minutes all the way to Rainier Beach. Then only about every 3rd or 4th streetcar that continued beyond Rainier Beach to Renton, the true interurban part of the line there. They had a real hard time making it, and there were several attempts to sell the company to the city. Well, the city was in so much debt already from the streetcar system that they really couldn't afford to take it on. And so the private company shut down in February of 1937, and were immediately replaced with buses. Thanks. Okay, I had that picture earlier of the James Street cable car down at 2nd and James. This is at the far end of the line at James and Broadway. And here the cable car line intersected with the East Cherry streetcar line. So if you were coming from the Central District, say along East Cherry Street or Madrona, and you wanted to go to the south end of downtown, well, you got off here and you transferred to the James cable car, which would take you down to 1st and James. And so this was the combination end of the line, the powerhouse for moving the cable, and the actual cable car barn where the cars were kept and maintained. And so we're looking north on Broadway here, and this was, one of several places here where electric cars crossed the path of the cable cars. The building, a real historic building that had a lot of nice Victorian touches to it, was demolished in 1960 when the city built James Way. So they basically leveled the building and built a street that headed down the hill towards 12th Avenue using that right of way. But it was a real interesting place. And one thing also to note is that today there's a streetcar line running exactly where the streetcar is in the picture. Today, the First Hill streetcar runs on this section of Broadway, right past where the old car barn used to be. We're going to move over here to the Montlake neighborhood. And in the distance in this picture, you can see the Montlake Bridge. At this point in time, there was no SR 520 or Evergreen Point Bridge or anything like that. The volumes of motor vehicle traffic were pretty modest on Montlake Boulevard. But look at the median, and if you go out there today, that median is just a fraction of the width that it is in this picture. Everything in this picture, the trees, the grass, it's all manicured and well maintained. It was a really nice, quiet neighborhood back in those days. And the Montlake streetcar started downtown. It went out to Pike Street to 23rd Avenue, and then down 23rd and 24th to the Montlake neighborhood, crossed the Montlake Bridge, went through the UW campus and up to its end of the line at 45th and Brooklyn. So it was a real busy line that served a lot of neighborhoods, served some big destinations like the University District. And once, of course, the 520 was built, traffic volumes increased dramatically, and much of this greenery was taken away here for additional traffic lanes. Now, this is at 34th Street and Fremont Avenue in downtown Fremont. And, you know, talk about a community that was shaped by streetcars. Fremont kind of thinks of itself as the center of the universe. Well, that may or may not be true, but they definitely were the center of the streetcar universe. Here at this intersection at 34th and Fremont was a full Grand Union track arrangement. Now, Grand Union is basically an intersection or a junction where you can make every possible movement. You can go straight ahead, you can go right or left, no matter which leg of the intersection you're approaching from. And so there was a huge amount of streetcar traffic at this point. There were 6 lines, 6 city streetcar lines, plus the Everett Interurban. And it's probably a little too difficult to see, but if you get a magnifying glass and look at the print, you can see the Everett Interurban way in the distance up the hill on Fremont Avenue in this picture on his way to Everett. So it was a really important and key place in the streetcar system. The Fremont Car Barn was located just 2 blocks to the left-hand side here to the west of the intersection. And during the rush hour, I mean, there was just always a streetcar in sight. It was so busy at this intersection. This picture was taken about 1938. Here's the other side of the Fremont Bridge, looking north. The Blitz Funeral Home is that building there over on the left-hand side, multi-story building. Building is still there. It was just recently renovated. The gas station that was there just in front of it for many years is gone, and it's been replaced by a new development. But a couple of things to note here. Streetcars ran in the middle of the street. They didn't pull up to the curb like a bus does. And so to board a streetcar, you had to step into the traffic lane. Well, you know, as traffic increased over time, that became kind of a big safety issue. So the city started installing these lights. You see that little column there in the center of the picture. It has a flashing light on it. In some cases, those were activated by the pedestrian who wanted to get out to the streetcar stop. And in other cases, they were flashing all the time. And so if you were going to board that streetcar that just came down from Finney Ridge, you had to walk across in front of that car that's in the picture, get out in the middle of the street and board at the front door, you know, go past the operator. And, you know, in many cases, you were kind of putting your life in your hands doing this, especially where traffic was really heavy, and especially at night. So this was an attempt here to call attention to the motorists. Hey guys, there's a streetcar stop coming up there. There's going to be people in the street. And it was apparently only marginally successful. And of course, after the switch to buses, there was really no need for them. Now, one other thing about this picture that intrigued me is that on the left-hand side, you'll see a shelter there that was intended both for people that were waiting for cars that were turning down Westlake Avenue, like the streetcar in the picture here, but it also served outbound streetcars that intersected with Westlake here on Dexter Avenue, where we're just slightly out of the picture. That shelter is still there after all these decades. It's still there, still being maintained by Metro.
Is that where the interurban sculpture is in Greenville?
Yeah, the interurban sculpture is just on the other side of the bridge. This is on the south side, the Queen Anne side. Now here, the photographer climbed up on the Aurora Bridge and was on the sidewalk, obviously, and is looking down towards Lake Union. And here we have a Dexter Nickerson car that's coming down Dexter from Queen Anne Hill, and then heading out Nickerson Street. The line ended at the Ballard Bridge, where Nickerson meets the Ballard Bridge. That was an interesting line in that was actually constructed by the city of Seattle in 1912. They were trying to get into the streetcar business by building their own lines before they bought the private company's system. And in the background here in this picture, you can see the old Seattle City Light steam plant. The building is still very much there, but of course, in those days, that served as a backup to the hydropower that was the predominant source of electric power in Seattle. The steam plant provided power during peak demand times, until the 1970s. There's also a couple of tall-masted sailing ships at the Lake Union shipyard in the back picture, if you look really closely here. Anyway, kind of a dramatic shot, I thought. There we go. Here's the Queen Anne counterbalance. So this was a streetcar installation that was so unique that the name counterbalance is still used to describe this real steep section of Queen Anne Avenue. This picture was taken in 1907. And what was so unique about the counterbalance was that it used kind of a blend of electric streetcar and cable car technology. An electric streetcar was limited to going up hills, maybe no more than 10 or 12% grade. And it wasn't that they didn't have enough power, it was lack of traction, adhesion on the rails that was the big problem. Well, that wasn't a problem with cable cars, because cable cars were pulled along by the grip attached to this underground cable. Well, here they didn't want to go to the expense of having a powerhouse with the cable constantly moving, powered by an electric motor or steam engine or whatever. And instead, what they did was they had an underground cable, but it was powered by a counterbalance sitting, basically just weight, sitting on a rail car that rode underneath the street. And so unlike a cable car, you had a much bigger tunnel underneath the street here. And when the electric streetcar got up to that point where you see the center slot that starts just before you headed up the hill, they would reach down and there would be this hook that would attach to the front of the streetcar. And then an operator at the top of the hill give the signal, and the counterbalance that was at the top of the hill would start coming down the hill and help to move the electric streetcar up the hill. Now, the same thing happened in reverse when you came down. When you came down, you were pulling that counterweight up the hill, and therefore that cable was serving as a brake. So you never had to worry about runaways. It was a very, very effective brake. So the cable-assisted electric streetcar operated just from Roy Street here at the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill at Highland Drive. And then you drop the hook came off, and the streetcar continued on its own electric power to the end of the line. Really ingenious idea. It didn't cost much to run. The energy was all free. It was gravity. And it operated pretty much without incident for 40 years. Long time. And so that's basically the story of how the counterbalance operated and how that section of Queen Anne Avenue got the name. And you also see here that there are crossover tracks. So you could see a streetcar operating towards you on the left, you know, English style occasionally. Back in those days, you could get away with things like that. But that's what would happen sometimes when the counterbalance was in the right position here to either assist you going up the hill or assist you in braking coming down the hill. Here's a shot here of the University Bridge. And there were 3 streetcar lines that operated on the University Bridge. This picture was taken in 1940. This was one of the busiest corridors outside of downtown for streetcars. That travel corridor between downtown and the University District then and now is one of the busiest transit corridors in the region. And so you had a steady flow of streetcars crossing the bridge, most of them running on East Lake Avenue into downtown. The number 15 was the exception. It went up Harvard and 10th Avenue East to Broadway, and then went to downtown from Broadway. And so that's what this particular car is doing. The other thing that caught my eye here was that they were using the trolley span wires to hold up American flags and a little ad for the Red Cross. And that's a real no-no today. You can't do that. But it was an inexpensive way of kind of getting your message up there, I guess. The University Bridge looks almost identical to this today. Now, farther north, past the U District, when you got to the vicinity of Ravenna Boulevard, and just before the Cowan Park Bridge, the track had a junction split into 2 sections. And if you turned right, you went directly into Ravenna Park. You're off the street, you're running on private right-of-way, and you had this beautiful view looking down into the ravine from the southern edge of the ravine. And, you know, with people's backyards on the right-hand side as you went through there. It was quite an interesting section of streetcar ride here when you went through Ravenna Park. And that private right-of-way lasted until you got down to Northeast 55th Street. Then you headed up the hill on Northeast 55th to Calvary Cemetery. And right at the corner of 55th and 35th Avenue Northeast was a turnaround. And then many years later, the cemetery bought the property. And I believe there's a cemetery building there today that is where the old streetcar turnaround loop is. Now, in this picture here, you also see the track that's more or less leading straight ahead and crossing Cowan Park Bridge. That served the 15th Avenue Northeast line that ended at 80th Street, right near the intersection with Lake City Way, what today is called Lake City Way. So there were 2 University District lines then that then continued across the University Bridge and East Lake Avenue into downtown Seattle. This is an interesting picture here of the Green Lake streetcar line. The stone faces here that you see that the streetcar is passing between were part of a pedestrian bridge that basically carried you into the lower Woodland Park area and closer to the lake. One of those faces is still there. The one on the left-hand side, one on the right has been removed, but it's quite distinctive when you go out there and look at it. By the time this picture was taken, the pedestrian bridge had been removed. It was basically a steel truss bridge that crossed between those two stone faces there at the top. The Green Lake line was really quite an adventure to ride because it made a complete loop around the lake, very close to the lake shore itself. And then when it got to made a counterclockwise loop, when it got to the vicinity of Aurora Avenue, it passed across several little wooden trestles in lower Woodland, and before reaching Woodland Park Avenue and then heading down the hill towards Fremont. It was one of the first major lines to be abandoned and converted to buses, but that happened about 1937, and due in part to construction work on Aurora Avenue, which was being pushed through Woodland Park at that time. Now, another construction project that affected the streetcars negatively was the reconstruction of the Ballard Bridge. So the city decided in 1939 that they needed to replace the approaches to the Ballard Bridge. So the original draw span in the middle was a steel bridge that opened in 1918, but it utilized old approaches that were built out of wooden timbers. And then by the late 30s, there was lots of money available to rebuild road bridges, but no money to rebuild streetcar bridges. So the city had, let's see if I can get that. There we go. So the city had to reroute streetcars that normally went out 15th Avenue West and across the Ballard Bridge into Ballard. They were rerouted to use the Fremont Bridge instead, and then went through Leary Way and Ballard Avenue to the intersection of 15th Northwest and Ballard Avenue, which is where this picture is taken. And so starting about May 1939, there were no more streetcars on Ballard Bridge. You took the streetcar to Ballard by riding through Fremont. You got off at Ballard Way, and you can see these people are getting off the streetcar and they're transferring to the bus, the connecting bus that would take them up 15th Avenue Northwest to 85th Street, which is basically where the streetcar used to go. So this picture shows one of the very first Seattle Transit buses. These particular buses were built by Kenworth, local builder, and they had that kind of very streamlined, modern paint scheme to them there. What looked like automobile fenders kind of painted on the side, very distinctive paint scheme and a silver roof. And boy, did they look fancy compared with the streetcars. So this was basically the start of the big conversion to motor buses and trolley buses.
What year was that?
This is 1939, or May of 1939. And that conversion was completed by April of 1941. So this is my parting picture here. This is the sign of things to come. In February of 1937, the same month as that terrible streetcar accident happened in West Seattle, Seattle got its first trolley bus. This was a demonstrator vehicle that came from a company in Ohio called Twin Coach. You can see its name there on the destination sign. And a temporary downtown loop was constructed that used 4th Avenue, Union Street, and 5th Avenue to universities. It's kind of around the block. And they ran this trolley bus on it, this demonstrator trolley bus. It was certainly proved to be a prophetic thing. I mean, Seattle is still running trolley buses today. 87 years after this picture was taken. But, you know, again, when you look at the condition of the streetcar system in the late 1930s, the newest cars had been built in 1917, and most of them had been built before 1907. Cable cars were even older. They were really, really ancient by the late 1930s. The city went to the federal government, and one of the Roosevelt administration initiatives had been an infrastructure fund where they loaned money to cities and to private companies to rebuild their infrastructure at very low interest rates. Nowadays, they would just make it a grant. Back in those days, it was a loan that you had to pay back. And that $10 million loan came to Seattle to refurbish its transit system is what led to the relatively early conversion of Seattle streetcars to buses and trolley buses. So this picture here kind of gives you that taste of the future. It's at Fifth and University. That's the Skinner building on the right. The Fifth Avenue Theater is located. On the left is the departed White Henry Stewart building. And you can see there's a good sized load on this trolley bus, even though it was a pretty short ride. And this definitely was a sign of things to come. By April of 1941, the last streetcar had operated, and eventually the trolley bus system had initially it had 235 trolleys, and eventually that went to 307 by the middle of World War II. So I'm going to cut it off there. I don't know how long I've been going. Here, I'm back to that original picture. If anybody had any questions or comments?
I'll just comment quickly. That was fun and to hear everything. I have a family memoir over here and I was trying to find the page, but I can't find it. But it tells how my ancestors took the trolley, and one of their stops was the Prefontaine streetcar, or where they got on there. And I used to work at the Prefontaine building. So it was like really cool little connection there with my ancestry.
Yes, oh, that really was, yeah.
Hearing all about that, yeah.
There was a big pulley that was underneath the street there, and next to Prefontaine. And when the downtown transit tunnel was being constructed in the late 1980s, they found this pulley, which was, oh gosh, probably 20 feet in diameter. And they saved it, and it is in the mezzanine of the Pioneer Square tunnel station to this very day. You can see it refurbished and everything, ready to service again.
As I recall, the toolbox was still there, and the lunchbox or something was still in there.
Yeah, that's right. It was like somebody just left for lunch, and that was at the end of it. It's all sealed.
Cables were, they were really huge, the diameter of them?
The end of the line cable was, yeah. The pulley was really large because they basically had to take the cable from one lane on the street and move it over to the next lane, and that's why it was so big. The other pulleys and sheets, yeah, not the cable. The cable was, not really all that thick. Yes, sir.
That electric trolley that went down the Pomeroy, did it go as far as Lincoln Park, or how far did it go down there? And also, how did it get across the bridges there, for the bridges that open and close and whatnot, the drawbridge, in the old days? Or did it come down and make connections in it so that the trolley could drive across, or did they get off and have to walk across and then reconnect, reboard another trolley?
I've got to come back and give my presentation that's just on the West Seattle bridges because it's really interesting. To put it short here, West Seattle was very isolated from the rest of Seattle until first bridge across the Duwamish was constructed about 1907. Okay, and before that, most people got to West Seattle by ferry. They took a ferry from downtown to the foot of Ferry Avenue, in West Seattle. And then there was actually a cable car line that took you up the hill to the Admiral District. So after 1907,
It was a cable car, not an electric trolley?
it was initially a cable car and then later on an electric trolley. Yes. And in 1907, a combination road and streetcar bridge was constructed across the Duwamish. And it was made out of wood, didn't last very long. It was replaced by a swing span bridge, with the center pivot swing span in 1917. And that bridge was also made out of wood and didn't last very long. And finally, bridge number 1, the first all steel bridge across the Duwamish, was constructed in 1924. And that was a bascule bridge, with counterweights on both sides of the Duwamish. And that was followed 6 years later by bridge number 2, which was identical to the first bridge. And so together, those two bridges lasted until that infamous freighter struck bridge number 1 in 1978.
Well, did they, for the electric trolley then, did they make contact when they broke contact? And then they have apparatus there that make contact again when they were close, so the trolley could go.
They had substations on both sides of the bridge, so there was power on both sides.
Oh.
And there were at least 3 substations in West Seattle alone, powering that end of the route.
Oh, so the power would begin and end at the bridge on both sides, eh?
Exactly. Yeah. The same thing exists today with the trolley bus system. There's power substations on both sides of the University Bridge.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It followed the right of way all the way down Falls Avenue, but towards the end of Lincoln Park, there was a parking lot. And did it take the diagonal road that kind of is a planet grade to end the line?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Must have gone, because I've seen the rail there in that big vicinity on the ground.
Yes. So when the streetcar was running on next to Lincoln Park, today that is traffic lanes, but at the time, that part of Fauntleroy Way was just a lane in each direction. It was just a 2-lane road, and so the streetcars pretty much had their own right of way hugging Lincoln Park. And then you're right, it didn't go all the way down to where the ferry is now. It turned off short of that, and it went down what was then private right of way, kind of like this little back alley right of way, over to the end of line business district.
And when was all of this wonderful trolley infrastructure ripped out? When did we destroy this trolley infrastructure?
Well,
40s?
Yeah, I mentioned here that this federal loan came through, $10 million, which was a lot of money in the late 1930s. And basically that permitted them to start converting from streetcars to motor buses and trolley buses. And so that process began in earnest in the middle of 1939. In September 1939, the Seattle Transit System, the own entities, but there was a huge change in the organization and how it was governed, who led it, how it was funded, all this kind of thing. And so from that point on, they were focused on converting the system from streetcars to buses.
Did it create an uproar?
There was a lot of mixed feelings about it. I think that particularly the cable cars had a real place in people's hearts in Seattle. People recognized how unique they were, how few places had them. By then, the only other place that had them was San Francisco.
Why did San Francisco retain its trolleys?
The last one.
Well, believe me, there were attempts to abandon them in San Francisco too. but I think that the fact that most of the system was in such terrible shape The cars hadn't been maintained properly. They were really, really old. The infrastructure was in bad shape. I mentioned there that West Seattle Viaduct, that shut down in 1929 because the city just didn't have money to repair it. So what they did is they shifted the West Seattle routes to use First Avenue South to get to Spokane Street after it was torn down. And so, a valuable piece of rapid transit was lost at that point in time. So I think there was a real mixed feeling on the part of the public about the conversion. And then, right about the time that the conversion was completed in 1941, just shortly after Pearl Harbor Day, and everybody was just kind of preoccupied with the war, and the system was just humming, so busy. All the ridership records in Seattle were broken during World War II. They would have been nice to have kept a few streetcar lines just to have a little more capacity.
Mike,
yes.
Really want to thank you for all this great information. I know you wanted a second to tell us about your book. We have a second speaker coming,
yes,
ready to come on this afternoon. So please tell us about the book. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to mention here, just very briefly, Seattle Streetcar Era, which I authored here, came out in December of 2021. And it's a pretty complete history of Seattle's streetcar system. And it has a lot of some of the pictures here that you've seen here today, a lot of others as well. There's about 200 pictures in this book. And it's got a lot of maps that explain how the system developed. So I have one copy with me today, and the last time I checked, University Bookstore still had it on the shelf. And you can also get a copy through the publisher, which is WSU Press in Pullman. They published it. And it is a hardbound, definitely a key. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that this presentation wouldn't have been possible, and even the book wouldn't have been possible, if it was not for the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive. And if you go to downtown Burien, just a block off Main Street on 153rd, is this kind of unassuming building that used to be a plumbing supply house. And there are 3 floors of archives relating to rail history in the Northwest. Most of it is big scale railroading, Northern Pacific, Great Northern, Milwaukee Road, and so forth. But I have in charge here the collection of streetcars, interurban railways, and electric railways that operated in the Northwest. So we have over 2,000 pictures of Seattle streetcars in that collection. And we're gradually putting them on, scanning and putting them online for people to see. So again, I really want to emphasize that PNRA, Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive,